We're now showing a programme called Bias in the News.
Only 14.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Split screen next.
The 6 o'clock news
7,
from the BBC
Mixed.
with Sue Lawley and Nicholas Witchell.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The Labour Party is preparing to expel a dozen of its members, supporters of the militant tendency.
Rumby, cut.
Hello. How much do you believe when you watch television and see the news? Do you accept what they say is true? Or do you think, I bet there's another side to that story? Or even, I reckon that's a distortion. Well, in fact, when the BBC first started making television news, most people regarded it as gospel truth. But remember, the news doesn't come down on tablets of stone carved in heaven. It's made up by ordinary people, working, as here, at BBC Television Centre in London.
A snatch of Gwyneth Dunwoody. See, you've got both sides of that argument.
The reaction of Mr. Hatton was obviously fairly interesting and, judging by the lunchtime interview, fairly evasive.
With the press and the media and many others coming out, obviously involved in personal character assassinations.
And my starting point is that Liverpool is the home of militant, and has been.
Right.
They're working under pressure of time, of sometimes limited information and resources, and they have to make decisions.
The problem is time.
Within a matter of hours, they must construct a slick and popular television programme and do it again and again and again. So how reliable is the product? Well, for at least 10 years, critics have been sniping at the news. One group said there was a bias against understanding. They thought the news tended to avoid complicated issues in case viewers got bored. The result was that the news oversimplifies the world and tends to show us only the sort of things the majority might want to see. But the most consistent attack has come from the department run by this man, John Eldridge, Professor of Sociology at Glasgow University. A few years ago, the Glasgow University Media Group sat down to watch and analyse every television news bulletin they could on every channel, and they've brought out a string of publications. Broadly, what they say is that television news is biased. It's biased in favour of the establishment, and it supports the status quo. Specifically, it's biased against the Labour Party and the left, and it undermines trades unions. Now, some broadcasters agree with them, but the overwhelming majority vehemently do not. They claim that it's the Glasgow Media Group that's biased, that their research is badly done, that their conclusions are plain wrong. Alistair Hetherington takes that view. He was a senior broadcaster himself, in fact controller of BBC Scotland. Before that, he was editor of The Guardian, and, like John Eldridge, he's now an academic. He's Professor of Media Studies at Stirling University. Now, for all I know, both of them may think that my introduction has been biased. So we're going to let them talk to you directly and try to persuade you of their views. Then we'll talk things through together. Now, we don't have long. We can only dip our toes into the argument. So they've concentrated on just one issue to illustrate the theme: how television news covered the miners' strike. First, hoping to convince you the news was biased, John Eldridge.
In the coal dispute, the Coal Board and the government were very interested in how many miners were returning to work. But the miners' union wanted to emphasise how many were staying out. According to a press report in The Observer, Margaret Thatcher came up with the idea of publishing the numbers of miners who'd gone back to work. These figures arrived every day on the news desks. Michael Crick, a journalist on Channel 4 News, described how this worked.
The National Coal Board's skillful propaganda claims that men are returning daily in hundreds, even thousands, and detailed figures are supplied first thing to news desks every day. Some journalists don't bother to attribute the figures to the board.
We can see how this works by looking at an actual news bulletin.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. Princess Margaret has had an operation at a hospital in London. A piece of her lung was removed yesterday and her condition is described as satisfactory. More than 1,200 miners have returned to work, the largest number to end their strike on any one day since November.
But who is it who's seen the 1,200 people? Obviously not the newscasters. So where does the figure come from? Later in this news, we are told that it's a coal board press statement.
It's been the first full working day in the coal mines since the Christmas and New Year holiday, and the coal board are claiming large numbers of miners took the opportunity to give up the strike. They say more men abandoned the strike today than on any day since the middle of November. Altogether, more than 1,200 miners were back at work for the first time, despite wintry weather in some areas which made it hard to get to the collieries. The biggest return was in the northeast, Yorkshire and Scotland, which accounted for more than 2/3 of the new starters.
The coal board and the government spent a lot of time and money making sure that their views were heard. And it has been claimed that their point of view was very favourably treated on the news. The same has been said about the police. During the coal dispute, there were many complaints from the police about violence from pickets, such as stone throwing. There were also many complaints made by miners about the police, about too much force being used and violence to pickets. But what did we see on the news?
The strikers' blockade was planned like a military operation, with miners arriving from all over the country. But the police responded with speed, matching the 5,000 pickets with thousands of their own forces.
Mounted, will you withdraw, please?
At first, police horses tried to shepherd the miners out of the convoy road. The violence reached a new peak as miners surged forward against the riot shields. Policemen fought with truncheons under a barrage of stones and missiles. By mid-morning, the picketing had turned to rioting. The police hadn't lost ground, but more riot squads were needed as reinforcements in the front line as the pressure increased. Eventually, senior officers ordered in the mounted police to disperse the miners. A gap opened and the horses galloped in. Police horses are the most feared weapon in the present armoury. But it's the riot squads that follow up to make the arrests. And today, on the fields around Orgreave, the police became involved in some of the most vicious hand-to-hand fighting of the entire miners' dispute. The attacks on individual policemen were horrific. The police commanders said it was a marvel that no one was killed.
That commentary made it clear that violence was coming from the miners. The reporter told us, first, the strikers' blockade was planned like a military operation. Second, the picketing had turned to rioting. Third, the attacks on individual policemen were horrific. But other people have blamed the police for escalating the violence. Another BBC programme called Brass Tacks got hold of the video that the police had made that day in Orgreave, and they asked an ex-Chief Constable, John Alderson, to look at it and give his view.
But isolated incidents from different viewpoints haven't settled the central question. Who was to blame for escalating the violence, police or pickets? The police cameras were on a rooftop behind their ranks, recording major events of the confrontation. Their 84-minute video forms the only known official recording of the day's events and the order in which they happened.
You've looked at more than an hour of the police video of Orgreave in June of last year. Judging from it, who attacked first?
I think it's fair to say that although there was pushing and shoving by the miners and one or two throwing missiles of one kind or another, the general escalation, the first escalation, it seems to me, came from the cantering of the horses into the crowd, which merely heightened the tension and increased the violence, which is contrary to what the police stand for. The police are there to diminish the violence, not to increase it.
Brass Tacks also looks at how the British police trained in new techniques before the miners' strike. According to Alderson, these techniques were borrowed from places like Hong Kong, where the police used much more force.
Was it a different tradition from British domestic policing?
Yes, the British had two policing traditions. It's very important to remember that. They had the policing by consent, the bobby developing this friendly rapport with the public, and in industrial disputes working out the least violent way of conducting it with the strikers on the one hand and the police on the other. Now, in the colonies, of course, the views of the people didn't matter at all. It was a question of repressive policing through force.
And have these two traditions, the British colonial tradition and the British domestic tradition, always been kept distinct?
Oh, yes, they've always been kept distinct. The British people would never have accepted colonial-style policing.
Just after 8:30 in the morning, what's happening here?
What's happening here is the commanders called up what are known as the short shield units, and they're an offensive group. They carry short round shields in one arm and their baton already drawn in the other. They wear NATO-type helmets with neck protection. They're for offensive purposes, and the kind of thing we saw from Hong Kong. In fact, this is a carbon copy of the Hong Kong riot squad.
Now, compare the news with the brass tacks programme. The news said the strikers planned a military operation, but brass tacks reported that it was the police who had paramilitary training. The news said the picketing turned to rioting. Brass tacks reported that police escalated the violence. The news said the attacks on policemen were horrific. Brass tacks showed violence on both sides. Alistair Hetherington's own research has shown that the news featured more than 10 times as much violence attributed to pickets as to police. All of this puts a big question mark against the concept of impartiality in news coverage.
Not impartial, one-sided news? No. I'd readily accept that there was a marginal bias in the reporting of both the events that John Eldridge chose, the return to work in January 1985 and the events at Orgreave 7 months earlier. A marginal bias towards the prevailing view of the great majority of people in this country. But not impartial, that's going too far. The reporters and the programme editors were doing their utmost to present a fair and accurate picture. I'll deal in a minute with those two episodes, the miners' return to work and the battle at Orgreave, and with what John Eldridge has said. First, though, let me make two general points. One is that, of course, you as the audience ought always to form your own judgments about what television news is telling you. You should look at critically, thoughtfully, skeptically, not believing everything that it says. As Nick remarked, it's not gospel truth. Because, and this is my second point, the news is gathered and presented by individual journalists, each of whom has to make a lot of individual judgments, often under great pressure of time. News doesn't arrive neatly packaged. The journalist has to go out and find it. Information handed out by governments or industries or trade unions or by football clubs is often less than the whole truth. The journalist has to look for the gaps, the flaws, the half-truths, and what's behind them. That's part of the interest of being a journalist. So journalists, often working alone and often short of time, will make mistakes, even though they are trying their hardest to present a fair picture. Now let's take the two cases. The return to work. John Eldridge has quoted Michael Crick, a journalist working for ITN, and a very good one. But John then presented the BBC's news as if it was playing the coal board's game. Yet look what the news actually said.
It's been the first full working day in the coal mines since the Christmas and New Year holiday, and the coal board are claiming large numbers of miners took the opportunity to give up the strike. They say more men abandoned the strike today than on any day since the middle of November.
So the BBC stated the source of the information, and it followed up with reports from its own men in Northumberland, Yorkshire, Scotland and South Wales, confirming that there had been a return to work. The 9 o'clock news used the same approach. And listen to what its reporter, John Fryer, said in summing up from Yorkshire.
In Yorkshire, though they'd no chance of stopping miners going into work, pickets stood for 2 hours in the freezing cold just to shout insults. That's how tough it's proving for the coal board as it seeks a breakthrough in the heartland of the strike. So far, the return to work in Yorkshire has been slow, patchy and unconvincing.
The return to work has been slow, patchy and unconvincing. One-sided? Certainly not. Next, Orgreave, an extremely difficult event to report, because no reporter or camera crew could see the whole site or every detail of what was happening, and because the Miners' Union had kept secret their plans for mass picketing that day. At first, the police were caught unprepared, so were many of the press. Throughout the day, the BBC had only one camera there. ITN had 3 because it had been tipped off. Now, the brass tacks programme, which John Eldridge quoted, used a police video of events at Orgreave from camera positions on a rooftop behind the police lines. Their cameras were trained on the open area where most of the pickets had assembled. But apparently they couldn't see the coking plant below or behind them. Some newspaper reporters, who could move more easily than the film crews, reported violent action by miners before the sequence shown to John Alderson, the former chief constable. Let me tell you what the Guardian's man wrote that day. The reporter was Malcolm Pithers, whom I have known for many years and whose accuracy I trust. I used to be his editor. Brass Tacks presented the event as beginning just before 8 o'clock. Malcolm Pithers was there 5 hours earlier, and the Guardian next day published his diary. 3 a.m. The early shift of policemen now on constant duty at Orgreave watches miners arriving nearby. The police, whose numbers at this time are stretched to their limit, see lampposts uprooted, a wall dismantled, and barricades erected. 5 a.m. Pickets gather at both ends of Highfield Lane. About 1,000 miners walk past a police line towards the plant. They easily outnumber the police, who make no attempt to restrain them. 7 a.m. Miners cross fields at the rear of the works, and a pitched battle begins with the police inside the coking plant. The police are temporarily overwhelmed, with missiles of all types being rained on them. Men with riot helmets and shields are ordered to the plant. 8 a.m. The first convoy of lorries begins to arrive at Orgreave. A riot shield is set on fire. South Yorkshire's Assistant Chief Constable, Mr. Tony Clement, calls up mounted police, and 2 mounted charges are made against pickets. So who started the violence? Not the police. They were outnumbered and overwhelmed at first, and indeed outnumbered all day. If John Alderson had known all that, his verdict might well have been different. What happened at Orgreave was a violent mass picket planned by the Miners' Union. It was a most disagreeable event for which the NUM must take primary responsibility. The BBC News provided a fair report. ITN was even better because it had 3 cameras there. Both were impartial, neither was one-sided.
Thank you. Before we go any further, let's just establish 2 or 3 facts. First of all, I take it, John Eldridge, that your main concern is the news. You're critical of the news. You seem to approve of Brass Tacks and presumably other television programmes.
We use the brass tacks example here to show that the same story can be interpreted and developed and explained in quite another way. And I think one of the problems that we face when looking at news is that the explanation which is given there to millions of people is the explanation which passes as the reality of that day.
So would you accept that the event actually happened, started 5 hours earlier than Brass Tacks presented?
Well, the question of origins is a very interesting one. When did the violence
Well, either it did
start?
or didn't.
Well, forgive me. The question of the origins of violence and of conflict didn't even, of course, start at Orgreave. So that when we want to start making judgments about the relative role of the police and the pickets and the role of the government and the role of the police in organising their own forces, we actually have to go out beyond Orgreave. In other words, we have to contextualise the whole discussion.
Now, are you saying, is your criticism primarily that news doesn't provide that context, or is that all of television is bad?
Oh no, that's not my criticism at all.
It's largely confined to news.
What I'm saying is that in the context of news, certain kinds of explanations may be preferred, and it's a question of examination to find out whether that's the case.
Now, is the reason for that you believe in a conspiracy, or do you believe that it's the stupidity of the journalists?
That is a classic question, if I may say so. I think it's neither a conspiracy, nor do I think it's the stupidity of journalists. I think if we wanted to talk about conspiracy, it wouldn't be a very helpful way of proceeding. What I do think is that a controversy which the miners' dispute represented, is multifaceted. That there are very powerful contending views with different interests, different values and so on, and that within that context there are certainly powerful groups who are wanting to persuade us of their point of view. The NUM wanted to, the government wanted to, the government so much so that it even put its own public relations person, Gordon Rees, into the NCB.
But you're suggesting the journalists were foolish enough to have fallen into that trap?
I'm suggesting that there are times when they may not think it through as much as they might, and that while I accept Alistair's comments about what the good journalist should be about, I don't think that always happens, and I think that that what the journalist needs to be aware of is that he or she works within a media of propaganda. There's a propaganda war going on.
Isn't that bound to be true, Alistair? After all,
of course,
there must be a predisposition,
yeah.
If only because if you look at how most broadcasting journalists are drawn from society, most of them are white, most of them middle class, most of them middle-aged, most of them male, most of them conform to this
I would
single pattern.
entirely agree with all that, but it doesn't mean that they are not endeavouring to, and on the whole succeeding in putting out an impartial account. They do try very hard at that. On the two specific events that John Eldridge chose, those were events of which the main facts were correctly and properly reported. In the case of Orgreave, an extremely disagreeable and very shocking event. And you can't try to cover it up and say that it was the fault of the police for using the wrong tactics, when in fact, for a long period before the police intervened with horses or with riot shields, there had been stone throwing, there had been building of barricades, there had been a number of acts of violence from the pickets' side.
So your main criticism of the Glasgow Media Group is not so much with their conclusions as with their methods. You're saying that it's pseudo-scientific, that it's not correct.
Yes, I would say that. I would disagree with some of their conclusions too, because I think on the whole, the media in this country do, excluding the popular end of Fleet Street, the media in this country do serve us pretty well, and they don't agree with that.
Do you think that, do you concede that there's a bias in your work, or do you think that your research is impartial?
Let me say this. I think that we have used the word bias in this programme as a kind of shorthand concept. And it almost carries with it the notion that there's something called biased news and there's something called objective news. Now, actually, that I think is a problem. What I would want to say is that when we think about the nature of news, we're actually looking at a product which comes through, and it comes through a number of filters. Now, it's well enough for Alistair to say that they intend to be fair and they want to do this and they want to do that. It's not so much a question of the intention, it's a question of what it looks like when it comes out at the other end. And what I'm saying is that you look at, the use of correspondence, the use of film, the use of graphics, the way in which particular causal linkages are built into the story, and that story is capable of differing interpretations. That's
now,
what
I've read all your books,
yes.
and all the bias that I see that you accuse the broadcasters of is bias against the left, if you like, and in favour of the establishment. When you were a controller of BBC Scotland, did you find that there was equal resentment, hostility, anger coming from the right of British politics and from the centre?
When I was controller of BBC Scotland, we had a Labour government in office, and the Labour government got, I think, on the whole, just as I've said that there is a bias towards the central view at that time, I think quite a lot of the news did have a marginal, and I emphasise marginal, bias towards Labour. And the Conservatives were furious, and we got a lot of complaints on that ground. I mean, you're quite right that people should look very carefully at this. They shouldn't take it as gospel truth. You're wrong, I think, in saying that the end result doesn't give a fairly reasonable representation of what is actually going on.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. If you want to take this further, these are the books to read here. If you do want to read what one side has to say, then please do read the other side as well. And next time, as we've all been saying, you watch the news, do watch carefully and critically, and see if you think that it gives you a fair and balanced picture of the world. Goodbye.
General Studies next week will be about the television adaptation of Malcolm Bradbury's novel, The History Man.